Okay, well the next thing to look at is the kind of structures that these types of evolution cause. And so we're looking at two new words here. We're looking at homologous structures and analogous structures. And they each pair up with a type of evolution. So divergent evolution, it causes homologous structures. And just the opposite, convergent evolution causes analogous structures. So when I talk about structures, I mean physical traits that organisms have, or they can be behavioural too. Normally we're talking about physical parts of the body of the species. So homologous structures, these structures are related, and they come from a common ancestor, just like the species did. So homologous structures are related by a common ancestor, Ca. Homologous structures might have different functions, but they might not. It just depends what the two daughter species use that structure for. So they're caused by divergent evolution, and they're really useful for determining if species are related. So useful for determining relatedness. In other words, if we can figure out if two structures are homologous, then that tells us these two species must have come from a common ancestor. So here are some examples of homologous structures. So in all the tetrapod animals, in other words, animals with 4 limbs, the front limb of all these animals is homologous. And the back limb too, actually, but we'll just look at the front one here. So the front limb of tetrapods, tetra means 4. So in lizards, here's what their front limb looks like. They use it for walking. Humans, our front limb, obviously, it's our arm, so we use it for carrying stuff and using tools. I'm using it as a pen, to hold a pen right now. Birds, they've evolved their front limb to be a wing. And then whales have evolved their front limb to be their flipper, to help them swim. So the structures are related. They might have a different function, but they've all come from a common ancestor, because the very first tetrapod that we've all evolved from, so this common ancestor here, it had 4 limbs and it had a front limb that had all these same bones. It's just that these 4 species here, we've evolved our front limb to do different jobs. Okay, well, analogous structures are the opposite. So I've already said analogous structures are caused by convergent evolution, which means that the structures aren't related, but they have a similar function, or they look similar. So analogous structures are unrelated. They don't come from a common ancestor. Because In convergent evolution, those two species have different ancestors that aren't related recently. Of course, everything's related if you go back a billion years, but not recently. So, like I said, analogous structures have similar function. And here's our example of some analogous structures. And wings are a great example. Lots of different species, completely unrelated, have evolved wings. So cicadas have evolved wings. Chickens have. What else have? Some of the flying reptiles, like the pterosaurs and pteranodons that lived when the dinosaurs did, or the big dinosaurs. They also evolved wings that were analogous to these two types as well. So these structures are analogous because the ancestor of the cicadas, well, it's just an ancient insect. And the ancestor of chickens, it was a tetrapod. And it just had 4 legs. It didn't have wings. So these species have evolved wings separately. Okay, here's some examples of homologous and analogous structures. So going back to homologous, this ancient species, which is the ancestor of all the insects and all the arthropods, which are things like spiders, insects, crustaceans, millipedes, they're all called arthropods. It had these 2 mouth parts here, these 2 front limbs, which it used as legs. Well, through divergent evolution, in spiders, they've evolved those 2 front limbs to be mandibles. Or in other words, fangs. So spiders have evolved these 2 front limbs to be sharp, some of them are venomous, and they're used for eating and catching prey. But the centipedes, they've evolved those 2 front limbs to be antennae. So antennae are used for sensing things, for feeling around and searching for prey, food and shelter and water. So these structures are homologous because they came from a common ancestor who had that structure. Okay, well here's an example of an analogous structure, and we talked about this one earlier. So in the sugar glider and the flying squirrel, we would call their skin folds that help them glide an analogous structure. Because their ancestors didn't have that structure, they just both happened to evolve them because they've evolved to suit the gliding role in their environment. Okay, 2 more. Here's another homologous example. Ancient primates. So the common ancestor of humans and of gorillas. This is what their skeleton looked like. And in particular their tail. The tail helped primates to balance when they're climbing through trees. It also helped them to grip onto trees. In humans, our tail has evolved to basically have no function. So our tail bones have been reduced so much that they do nothing, which is called a vestigial structure. So it has no function. And then gorillas, they still walk on 4 legs mostly, and they've kept their tail for its same role. But our tail bones and the gorilla's tail bones, they're still homologous structures because they've come from our common ancestor, which was our primate ancestors. And lastly, here's an example of some analogous structures. In fish and dolphins, they both have front fins. But for fish, well, their ancestor that's common is the very first vertebrates that had a backbone, and they didn't have fins. Fish evolved fins later, but dolphins, well, they've evolved from these ancient mammals here, and they obviously had 4 legs, so they've evolved their front limbs to be flippers and fins, which means the fins of a fish and the front flippers of dolphins are analogous because they haven't come from a common ancestor. Alright, so that is how divergent and convergent evolution cause homologous and analogous structures.